guest this time on Disaster Empire Quick Views is Erick Anez. Thank you for joining us, and to our audience, don't forget to like and subscribe to help grow this channel. Erick, can you give people an overview of your background for those who aren't familiar with you already?
Sure. So yeah, first of all, Ashley, thank you so much for having me on. I think these conversations are a fantastic way, not only for us to get to know each other throughout the industry, but also bounce around ideas, which is how new ideas come about. So kudos to you for putting this together and bringing folks from all different walks of life and industries to have these conversations. So a little bit about me. So I am currently the VP of Operational Risk and Resilience for Finastra, which is one of the largest fintechs worldwide. I've been in the risk space for about 15 years. Been lucky enough to being able to do almost every component of the risk world, from enterprise to operational risk, physical security, business continuity, crisis management. So my view, and sometimes is a little bit different than I would say your traditional resilience professionals, because it's always looked at through the lens of risk management, which is what the industry is sort of vectoring towards to now, which is great to be a little bit ahead of the curve, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, anything else that you want to share with the audience about yourself? Maybe a fun fact before we dive in?
Fun fact, let's see. So I am much taller in person than I am on video. I can attest
to that.
Yeah, so I am 6'7", play guitar. Have two little ones. I have two girls. I'm a girl dad to a 5 and a 2-year-old. Yeah, that are pretty crazy. So they're actually like right there, if you can see them, and they keep me pretty busy. So.
Excellent. Well, hey, resiliency means different things to different people. It's just definitely an evolving term in our field. How do you define it?
That's a great question. So I think the way that I look at resilience is it's really the organization's capacity to fail safe in a way, right? One of the different things that I think about resilience is that usually we think that resilience is this thing that you achieve and you sort of put that badge and you walk around, you're saying, I'm resilient. But resilience really ebbs and flows throughout the organization, throughout each function. I look at resilience more as like the battery charge on my phone, right? Sometimes I may have a full charge. Sometimes I may have to go in low power mode because I'm at 3%, right? And really based on the conditions around whatever's happening in the organization is going to be the level of resilience that you have. Which I think it's an interesting conversation to have with people within the organization, especially with your executive teams, because we have this concept that is this mountain that we climb, and once we climb it, we're sort of done, right? It's looked at as a project instead of just an ongoing thing.
Mm. Hey, tell us about your resiliency program at Finastra and what it was influenced by.
Yeah, so our resiliency program sits under the risk management side of the house. I would say that it's been influenced by mistakes made along the way from my learning journey throughout the risk world. Sometimes you try things that you sort of have that eureka moment that it's like, oh, this is a really cool initiative, really cool idea, and it's going to go into my greatest hits. Other times you try something that doesn't work out all that well, right? I would say that having those 15 years of experience were really great for the program that we built within Finastra. It's really influenced heavily around culture. At my previous role, my main sort of responsibility was work around safety culture for a maritime logistics high-risk environment organization. And that sort of opened my eyes a lot to what resilience means and how to look at resilience. And we really crafted the program within Finastra to give the organization a view on where we're vectoring, but also understand, like I mentioned earlier, that resilience ebbs and flows. And at the same time, that our ultimate goal is not to have an output that's plan or a document. Our ultimate goal is to make sure that we take all the discovery out of the way. So when failure happens, whatever that failure may be, right, whether it may be a system, whether it may be a process, whether it may be a location, we've already built the strategic approach to how we're going to react. And you get all that discovery out of the way and you can jump right into that solution. And it also has a lot of different components baked in around operational learning, right? So we really look at everything that we do in resilience as another form of feedback for the organization to learn from itself. And if you really get philosophical about operational excellence, there's no better way to learn than from yourself, right? And the things that you're doing right and you're doing wrong. And that's what we try to do within our resilience program, right? Use those inputs to sort of hold up the mirror and say, this is where we are. Do we like what we see? If not, how do we change it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I first became familiar with you when you did a presentation on resiliency culture. Could you talk a little bit and describe for the audience what that is, what it's all about, and really how that has developed over time?
Yeah, I think it was so that actually started as part of that safety culture maturity that I was talking about, right? Mm-hmm. And that was sort of the aha moment for me where I said, looking at the occupational health and safety field, they've gone through this evolution, right? Where at first you would look at something that would happen and you would say, well, what went wrong, right? And then that what went wrong lasted about 3 seconds. And then it went to who did something that they weren't supposed to do, right? Yeah. So there was this whole culture of blame around that, right? Mm. And I felt that in the resiliency world, because obviously our industry is a lot younger than, let's say, the safety field. Mm-hmm. We were at that point, this is going back 7-8 years, we were at a spot where blame was a big thing for us, right? From the resiliency perspective. So if a system failed, we looked at, okay, so who didn't do the right thing? Who didn't identify the right dependencies? Who didn't tell us that this could happen, right? And always went to who. And the components that safety had done is instead of the people that are conducting these high-risk activities, instead of them being the problem to solve, they were looked at as the problem solvers, right? Because they are the ones that are interacting with the risk every single day. And at the end of the day, they do not want to get hurt. They want to go home, if not in the same condition, in better condition than how they got to work, right? And it took switching that around for me a little bit, right? To say that in our BIAs, we shouldn't be trying to find what's wrong or what's a gap in recovery or what processes are not documented correctly. It should be an opportunity to have a conversation to really understand the process, understand the organization. Mm-hmm. And we're not able to do that from a cultural standpoint if we don't have the openness to say, we're not looking to see what you're doing wrong. We're trying to understand the systems that are at play and the systems that interact with each other that make successful work happen. Right. So it was switching the thinking of how do we focus on failure? Right. So instead of going to the BIA process, and I use the BIA process because it's one that we all can relate to. Right. Yeah. Instead of going to the BIA process and saying, tell me what you would do if this happened, it would be, tell me how you do this process. Right. If everything goes well, how do you do it? What systems are in place? What dependencies do you have, right? But not from the scope of think of this breaking down, from the scope of how is this happening today? How is it going to happen tomorrow? How did it happen yesterday, right? Yep. Because then that gave us two things. It gave us the ability to understand interconnectedness between these processes, mm-hmm. but then it also allowed us to understand how these critical systems are actually made up and how they interact with each other.
I think that's so key. And as what I'm hearing from you is the importance, one, of really having a deep knowledge and understanding of the business and really understanding the business risk. One of the things that I'm really starting to clue in on is we're often in our area really looking at the worst case scenarios of things that could happen. But for me, I'm starting to really assess the business and looking at BAU, right, as well. So those daily risks they're concerned about for resilience all the way through. So, for example, if something happens and fraud occurs, and they had to let go of employees internally, that's a crisis for the business in the moment, especially right now, the way that talent is just so challenging to get on board. So I don't know if you're thinking about those things as well, but that was just coming up for me as you were describing that situation.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think you hit on a fantastic point in how we build our program at Finastra. We don't have planners, right? So in our team, we do not have business continuity planners. We have business continuity advisors, right? And I think, so words matter, right, in my opinion. And I think they matter in that sense in particular because their role is to be strategic advisors within the business to help create the tactical steps when something does happen, right? But they're not focused, as you mentioned, they're not focused on everything that could go wrong, right? They're also not focused on an all hazards approach, which I think it works fine for some emergency management components, but when you transfer that to the private sector, all hazards, it's very incomplete in my opinion. But they're really, and I say this a lot, they're really holding up the mirror, right? They're having those discussions and they're saying, okay, let's talk through it and let's understand where you are. Let's understand where you want to go, because the other component that this cultural journey takes you on is usually when the resilience program starts, the business automatically assumes that the resilience team owns the risk and owns the capacity to be resilient for that operation, right?
Absolutely.
And in essence, I think it's funny because as resilience practitioners, we sort of get annoyed at that, right? To say, how do you expect me to own your resilience? But think about how we engage in the business. So we're engaged in the business saying, hey, I want to talk to you about what you're going to do when everything goes wrong. And at the same time, I'm going to tell you how your idea or your plan is deficient. You pretty much are saying, I need to come in to run the disaster for you or run the resilience for you. Where if you have the conversation around regular operations, you're saying, hey, this is your operation. Your operation has risk with which you own. I'm here as a strategic advisor to help you understand those risks and come up with ways together to lessen the impacts of those risks. If we're not able to lessen the impacts of those risks, how do we know how those risks are going to develop if they do materialize themselves? Right? Because I'm going to say something that's very controversial, and it's most plans are ineffective, right? And I think those of us that have been doing this for a little while can tell you that you're never going to have an incident where you're going to open a plan and that plan is going to walk you beginning to step through that event, right?
Yep.
But what the planning process does is allow you to have those conversations so that when something does happen, you sort of have a strategy in your back pocket, right? And I actually like to write my plans, especially my big crisis response plans, just the first 24 hours, right? I don't look at what are we going to do a week into the incident because I don't know the different variables, right? I don't know how the failure is going to materialize, how it's going to develop, how it's going to impact different systems. So if you focus on the first 24 hours or even the first 48 hours, and then you focus on what is the process and how we're going to keep the assessment process going so that we're always 12 to 24 to 48 hours ahead of the response, that's really the key. So that takes switching from going 100% in on planning to maybe going 50 to 60% on planning and 40% on really heavy training, not just tabletop exercising, but really understanding the components, stress testing, going through all these other things to make sure that people are ready to respond in that capacity. Everybody knows their roles, and you're able to do it before things are really stressful, and you're able to do it in a safe environment, per se.
I really like that concept, but tell me, because I know that, you must work across multiple locations and in several jurisdictions, right, in countries. How is that working in terms of culture?
Yeah, so I think culture is culture is an output, right? So you really have to be very careful of the inputs that go into that. One of the inputs is understanding different subcultures, as you mentioned, right? So when you're working across the globe, there's different ways to interact. There's different cultural cues and norms that we need to be aware of before we go into those relationships. A good example is, in Western cultures, we take silence as agreeing with something, right? Mm-hmm. So if I were to say to you, hey, Ashley, I have this whole plan, I walk you through it, and I have this beautiful PowerPoint that I take it from point A to point B, and you don't voice any concerns, I take that as Ashley's on board, we're moving forward, we're doing this, right? In other areas of the world, that silence may be that I don't agree, I need time to think about it, right? So it's understanding those different components that interact with each other, those different people, systems, cultures that are coming together to build that output. So you have to be very deliberate, right? It's like cooking a meal, right? You can't go all salt or all pepper, right? So you have to have a good mixture of the two to get that desired outcome that you want.
Absolutely. And sometimes you have the sweet and the savory at the same time.
That's right. That's right.
Hey, can you talk a little bit about your resilience scoring model? I found that fascinating when I heard about it. And could you share that with the audience at a high level?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've struggled with my entire career is that we operate in this absence of a null say, right? Mm-hmm. You can't really measure how many systems didn't fail. You can't measure how many fires didn't happen. You can't measure how many evacuations didn't take place, right? So it's very hard for us to, aside from point out things that need to be fixed, to really talk about those opportunities to celebrate success. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we looked into was, if we talk about this concept of resilience, right? And we say that resilience ebbs and flows, right? And based on different business conditions, these things tend to change. How do we do a snapshot on that to show the organization where different functions are improving, staying the same, and in some cases sort of going back on the resiliency efforts, right? So what we came up with was a resiliency scoring model of just a 0 through 10. So 0 means that no resilience is in place, right? And usually for a function to be at a 0 or a 1, it may be a newly created function that has never gone through a risk assessment, has never gone through an impact assessment. There's really nothing in place, right? All the way to an organization or a function that may be at an 8, 9, 10, where you have plans, you do tabletops, you have documented procedures, you have documented procedures not only for how you do your business as usual tasks, but you have documented procedures on how you're going to transfer work, how you're going to fall back from one system to the other. It was really capturing those different components and having the dependencies. So the way that we do our business continuity planning is that aside from gathering all that process information and how it takes place and what is needed to be done, we focus on 4 key components. So we focus on looking at dependencies around places, right? Real estate, actual physical locations. We look at technology applications. We look at required vendor services, and then we look at key people. So we take those 4 components, right? And we look to see what is the resiliency of those individual dependencies? How do they aggregate up to a departmental level itself? And then we take a look at the department as a whole and saying, okay, you have all these dependencies, you have all these processes, you have all these different portions of criticality within what you do. And then how are you structured to do it? What is your resiliency culture? What does your training look like? And this allows 2 things. So this reinforces the advisory aspect of our business continuity advisors, because it allows the advisors to say, here's where you are, the resiliency score. And it doesn't mean that it's a bad thing if you are at a 5 out of 10, because maybe your operation is not critical enough to where we only need a 5, right? But it gives them the ability to give suggestions on how to improve resilience, right? So those are baked into our annual business continuity planning process, and then we do a 6-month review. So every 6 months, we're refreshing processes, dependencies. That resiliency score gets refreshed. And in most cases, you do see that go up, right? Usually, if you want to improve it, you have to measure it, because if you don't measure it, you're never going to improve it. And in some cases, it goes back, right? And it goes back because we may switch a system. We might have added a new process that, it's still in beta mode where things aren't fully flushed out. But those are conversations that then we have with leadership to sort of show them this is exactly where we are.
Hey, so as we wrap up today, I'm curious to know what risks are of greatest concern that are on your mind, and then how do you believe your resiliency program can assist in mitigating that, or helping the organization to thrive through a crisis going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the highest risk that organizations face is not really understanding the complex systems that they operate in. And I say that because if you look at today, so if we take 2022 in comparison to 1992, right, things seem a lot easier today, right? I don't have to go into the DNB and wait in line and get there at 5 o'clock in the morning if I lost my driver's license. I can go online, I can order a replacement, right? It's right there. But what we fail to understand is a lot of different complex systems that are interconnected, that interact with each other to make that happen, right? And that makes it very difficult to understand where failure is going to happen. And once it happens, how is it going to develop and sort of work across your systems? So as much as, and I've had these conversations in every organization that I've worked in, and I've had it with peers in the industry, to where we sort of build these like safety blankets around certain things. I think SaaS applications are a great example, right? Yeah. We'll say, well, we don't really have to worry about it because it's in the cloud, it's with a SaaS provider. And that may be true, right? Mm-hmm. Potentially 99% of the time that may be true. But do we know what would happen if that cloud provider were to fail?
Still live somewhere.
Exactly. Yeah. So how is that failure going to develop? How is it going to impact everything else? So I don't want to say that organizations are at a surface level, because every organization is at a different level, how they're evaluating and measuring risk. But I think it's understanding the complexity of those systems, which in essence takes everyone in the organization, right? Because all these systems are now interconnected. And when I say systems, I don't mean just technology systems. To where your resiliency program or your risk management program is not embedded into the fabric of the organization, you're just doing something in a vacuum. And every time you do something in a vacuum, the failure usually happens outside of the vacuum, right? So then it's how do you bring it in?
Right. Hey, thank you so much for your time today. As with you and many of the other guests, I could talk all day because it's so much fun to share this knowledge. So I thank you for doing that and being a thought leader to step forward and to do that with the audience. And for the audience, I hope that you'll join us next time. Before we wrap up, though, Eric, any final thoughts for the audience that you'd like to share, and anything else that you're involved in that you'd like them to know about?
I would say stay curious, have these conversations. I think there's just like I mentioned about the planning, the main attribute of planning, that it's having those conversations to get the discovery out of the way. I think having chats like this with our peers, it's another way to sort of fuel that creativity and sort of develop together what the future of our field will look like. So more than happy to connect with anyone on LinkedIn and have a virtual beer over this stuff. Add me and let's have a chat.
Great. Any other ways that they can get in contact with you, or is LinkedIn the best way?
LinkedIn is the best way. I'm also a global advisor with the Crisis Ready Institute. We put a lot of mastermind classes together in different programs that are available to the public, not just the membership. So I would say check that out as well. A lot of cool initiatives coming out of that. Really, really robust global advisory council that we have there with a lot of knowledge. And I know those folks are in the same boat as me. They love to have conversations and connect with people from all different walks of life.
Great. We'll add that information into the link below. So thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Have a good one.